Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about how automated delivery could be shaping the future of local commerce. As we all know, COVID-19 has highlighted both the value of home delivery and of contactless service, and automated vehicles could potentially enable both. Behind the scenes, companies have been working to develop the technology to enable driverless automated vehicles to deliver goods. And although widespread deployment is still a few years away, such service could have pretty dramatic effects on transportation and local commerce. So today we've two experts with us that will help talk through some of these issues. And in particular, we're going to be having a presentation from an independent study that focused on the possible economic impacts of automated vehicle deliveries with the Steer Group, and then insights from AV delivery company Nuro. So my two panelists today are Alia Verloes. Alia is a public policy specialist and urban strategist with a focus on smart mobility, applying technology in cities and responding to societal changes. She holds a master's degree on regional and urban strategies from Sciences Po Paris. Alia currently works in the new mobility team at Steer, exploring the potential opportunities and impacts of disrupted technologies in cities across the world. We also have Matthew Lipka, who's the head of policy at Nuro, a robotics company that's building and deploying fully autonomous on-road vehicles in last-mile delivery service. In this role, Matthew works with regulators, policymakers, advocates, and his Nuro colleagues to shape policies and products that accelerate the benefits of robotics for everyday life. So with that, before we turn it over to our panelists and our presentation, I'm just going to talk about format briefly. So we're going to start with a 10-minute presentation by Alia, who's going to walk through the new report that they put together on the impacts of delivery AVs on local commerce and on society writ large. Following that, we're going to have a Q&A session where I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask some questions to both Matthew and Alia. And then we're also going to take questions from those of you that are on the live broadcast today. If you have a question at any point, please type that question into the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. I've already seen a couple questions come in, and there will be slides on today's presentation, and those slides will be available, as will the recording of this webinar following today's presentation. So take a look at your email for that. You should be getting something from us in a little bit. So with that, we are going to turn it over to Alia, who's going to walk through the presentation. Take it away, Alia.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. Also want to mention that the final report will be also available. I'm sure we will share links after this webinar. So hope everyone is well, and thanks again, Paul and the Eno Center team for the opportunity to present today an independent research that the Steer team has been working on in the past few months. So as you heard, my name is Alia. I'm based in our Steer New York City office, and I'm the market leader for new mobility in North America. And for those who are not familiar with Steer, or Steer Davis Gleave, as we used to be called, we are a professional service company, and we are a specialist in transport, cities, and infrastructure. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's not a secret that COVID-19 has accelerated the focus on delivery services of all kinds, including the one that remove human through, automation. And behind this, there is the assumption that AV could enhance the convenience, the affordability, the efficiency of last mile delivery. So I've seen a lot of reports on AV deliveries, and I think the first thing we need to talk about is terminology. So generally, AV delivery services can be classified into three categories. Last mile personal delivery device for sidewalks, so we're talking Starship robots, for example. autonomous vehicle for the road, and so that includes the modified passenger cars as well as the custom on-road delivery vehicles from companies such as Nuro, and drones, so delivery drones by air, so we're talking Prime Air by Amazon, for example. So this study focused only on the vehicle for the road, not even truck, with level 4 or above in terms of automation. And for those of you who are not familiar at all with what delivery AV services are and how they work, so a bit like the one that Nuro are operating, it simply works like this. So a customer orders groceries or other products online. Items are picked and packed in store and brought to waiting delivery AV. As a customer, you receive a notification and you know when the delivery is going to arrive. And once you have unloaded and accepted the goods, the AV delivery drive onto your next customer. Next slide, please. Thank you. So over 85% of trips in the US are currently made by private vehicles, which are a significant traffic congestion, collision, and transport emission, particularly in urban areas. I'm sure most of you on this call are aware of all these important indicators. The use of electric AV for deliveries could have the potential to reduce these negative externalities. And it is actually in this context that Nuro has commissioned us to conduct an independent study to evaluate the potential impact, economic impact, but also wider benefits of introducing delivery AV on the US economy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of methodology, our team considered the following elements. So we started from a scenario-based approach, and we've analyzed the trends in VMT by private vehicle for shopping and errands trip across the US to evaluate the proportion of VMT that could be replaced by delivery AV at a national, but also at selected state level, California and Texas to be exact, between 2025 and 2035. Our next step was to consider the economic impact through an input and output model analysis for the national level. And finally, we have analyzed the wider benefits, including safety, emission, and time saving for both national and the selected states that I mentioned earlier, and developed, of course, recommendation. And I'm sure we'll have time to discuss them at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, the study considered 3 potential future scenarios. One is the gradual shift scenario, and you will see this name quite a lot during the presentation because it is the main scenario we used to explore the economic impacts. The 2 other are the conservative scenario and the disruptive shift scenario that are used to provide an indication of potential slower or quicker adoption of delivery AV services. And for each scenario, we've analyzed a range of potential factors that could affect the demand or the supply of delivery AV, including consumer acceptance, growth in e-commerce, curbside delivery, cost of services, obviously the advance of delivery AV technology and AV regulation. Next slide. Thank you. So with all of that, we find out that over 300 billion trips are made annually by private vehicle, out of which around 40%, so it's like 125 billion trips, are made for shopping and errands purposes, and they are considered in scope for our analysis. We then evaluate the proportion of VMT that could be replaced by delivery AV services, depending on obviously the scenarios. And under the gradual shift scenario, that would be around 23% of in-scope VMT. So this is around 190 billion VMT for shopping and errand trips. In order to evaluate the number of delivery AV required to meet the demand for those services, we developed 2 assumptions on the capacity and the utilization for these services. And again, under a gradual shift scenario, that leads us to a total of 3.1 million delivery AV that would be required to meet the demand for those services in 2035. To give you an example, and this is national number, for Texas, it is around 300K, and for California, 460. Next slide, please. So of course, this is a COVID time, and just a note on that, you will see when you will read the report that the external inputs to this report were prepared prior to the current COVID-19 situation and do not consider related impacts However, some experts suggest, obviously, that COVID-19 has had some impact on this market in a way of amplification. So we've seen e-commerce experiencing growth in categories such as groceries, an acceleration of experiment and evaluation of delivery services. And from a supply side, quite interesting things related to maybe a bit more appetite for delivery and AV companies launching delivery initiatives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the next section, we evaluated the impact of investment made by delivery AV services sector on the US economy in terms of both direct economic impact and wider benefits. And our analysis shows that under a gradual shift scenario, that could lead to a potential aggregate value generated of 4.1 trillion between 2025 and 2035. And let me go into the details in the next two slides. So next slide, please. So again, under a gradual shift scenario, a total investment of around 1.1 trillion between 2025 and 2035 would be required to build and operate the 3.1 million AV required to meet the demand. So this is what I was explaining to you in a few slides. The direct economic impact of this, so we're talking gross output, is expected to be 3.4 trillion on a gradual scenario. And if we need to break down that, this is around 60% of expected additional value add to GDP. It is an interesting, actually, I think, output of the study because it is showing that the AV delivery sector is quite high productive, and that could be explained by the AV delivery relying on investment in high value add resources such as technology, retail, or research and development. Related to employment, a few words on that, obviously. The deployment of delivery AV is expected to have disruptive effects on several industries and professions, and the future is still uncertain, especially the scale of the impact and the extent and speed at which the technology will roll out, as well as the type of job created and consumer practices. So our analysis show that the move to delivery AV is expected to create additional job in different sectors, either directly or indirectly related to the new technology. And we have reflected that through the concept of job years or person years, which is a unit of measurement for work done by individual throughout the year. So one job for 1 year is a one job year. So our analysis is estimated that employment generated would be approximately 34 million job years between 2025 and 2035 across all impacted industries. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of wider impact, so there is several that we have listed here, and I'm going to start with road accident. The report is showing that delivery AV are expected to improve road safety in two primary ways. They're expected to reduce, the frequency of collision and reduce the numbers of people at risk in any potential collision, as there's no human occupant within the delivery AV. And in terms of economies of batching, that could lead to less VMT, therefore less risk exposure to collision. Therefore, we have estimated that 244 injury-causing road crashes could be avoided. To give you an example and a comparison, this is the equivalent to the number of such incidents in Texas during the entire 2019. In terms of time saving, we have evaluated that 21 billion hours of driving trips for shopping and errands purpose could be saved. That represents 87 hours, or again, just to give you a comparison, it's about 11 vacation days per year per person using the service. And obviously, time saving can be measured in many ways. And on our case, it could actually be higher because we have excluded in this study the time spent when you are shopping on a store, and obviously also potential longer travel time that have not been considered. Related to emission impacts, delivery AV are likely to not only be electric powered, but also lightweight compared to the standard gasoline vehicles and autonomous passenger vehicles, which would lead to a significantly lower level of emission per VMT. And our analysis show a reduction in CO2 emission of around 407 million short tons, which is the equivalent of 88 million passenger vehicles off the road for 1 year. Next slide, please. And that is my final slide. To achieve these societal benefits, so save lives, save time, reduce air pollution, public and private sector players will need to collaborate. And we come up with a list of recommendations that you're seeing now on the slide. I have a question for you, Paul. Do you have time to go through all of them, and we can always discuss them during the Q&A?
Yeah, go ahead, please go through. I think that people are interested in the recommendations, so go ahead.
Great. All right, so the first one is obviously the increase of experimentation and testing. We do think that we need additional case studies and scenarios for delivery AV services to better understand the broader range of social benefits. The second one is an harmonized or more harmonized regulatory environment. So creating an harmonized regulatory environment to help and improve the strategic planning and investment. The third one is about community outreach and engagement. We need to better understand the drivers and the challenges that delivery AV could represent for end users in terms of accessibility and acceptability. Obviously, there is a point, and an important one, on ensuring equitable job creation. And for that, we do suggest that further cost benefit studies should be conducted to better understand the impact on different groups and the potential for job creation in communities, and obviously also the work of decision makers. The fifth point is about multimodality and how these services could be complementary to existing mobility ecosystem in a city, and understand how they could facilitate a wider mobility ecosystem. And the last one, not the least, is access to the best. We do think that, and it's more maybe a comment for private sector, that they should access to their best the local governments and communities in the COVID-19 crisis. That's it.
Got it. That's a lot to cover.
It is. Again, like the report is available, so data, methodology, etc., is available for you all to read. And a part of the question I'm sure you are all going to ask today, feel free to ask us other questions after this webinar.
Fantastic. Yes. No. So again, for everyone on the line, thank you for sending questions. We got a few dozen, Alia, during your presentation, and I had a couple that I wanted to ask both to Matthew and to Alia, but there's a few that I think would be relevant just to touch on right now before we kind of get broader, specifically about the report. And a lot of these questions kind of get into the methodology question of your report. Can you talk just a little bit about the methodology, the software, the models that you use to put all this together, and kind of maybe elaborate too on how those were all interrelated to the outcomes on the job piece, on the environmental piece, on the VMT piece, and etc.
Yeah, of course. And there's different points, so I'll try to summarize that to the best of my ability. So as I was explaining, the report and the entire report is based on a scenario-based analysis, which means that we did extensive research, talk with experts in the industry from public sector and private sector to better understand how to create these different scenarios, so the conservative, the gradual, and the disruptive one. And based on that, we've also assessed, there's several indicators I mentioned, impact of car ownership trends, impact of technology, e-commerce trends, and some assumptions on AV technology that were used to build them. We then, switched to the demand analysis. We've analyzed the private vehicle trips by trips purpose and evaluate the in-scope VMT. That help us to forecast, based on the trends in socioeconomic factors affecting private VMT, including population and GDP growth, the forecast, for 2025 and 2035. When we've done that, the in-scope VMT, we analyzed the in-scope VMT that could be replaced by delivery AV. And we applied, obviously, to that the different scenarios, and I've just mentioned, obviously, the gradual one. And then we estimate, the the number of AV that would be required to meet the demand based on these assumptions. So when we've done that, and I think I mentioned very briefly, what we actually did is an input and output model approach to analyze the economic impact analysis. So we use the Implan input and output modeling software to evaluate the impact of investment made by delivery services on the US economy. And you will see that in the report, all of that has been defined, and the methodology step by step is defined. And that helps us obviously getting the numbers and the outputs I've presented in terms of gross output, gross value add, and employment. They are direct, indirect, and induced impact. All of that has been taken into account for this analysis. For the wider impact analysis, we've used a range of different elements, to be honest. So some cost benefits indicator to help us with the time saving aspect. Obviously, all US FAST and EIA indicator to analyze the road accident and the impact in terms of emissions. Is it answering the question?
Well, I'm sure there's some specific questions that have come in, and I think perhaps we can follow up with those folks directly about some of their detailed things afterwards, because we want to make sure that we get to everything. I think we could talk through the methodology for the rest of the 25 minutes we have here. But one of the things that's come up, actually, two people have asked this question, and I think this can be directed both towards Matthew and to Alia. And we'll start with Matthew, right? Because Nuro commissioned this study, and Steer conducted it as kind of an independent group. And this is again for both of you, what surprised you once the study was finished and you had some of the outcomes? What were some of the things that you weren't really expecting from the study? What did it kind of tell you that was kind of not necessarily what you expected? Again, Matthew, and then we'll go to Alia.
I'll mention two things. So one is the size of the numbers are pretty big, right? So if you think about the forecast, it's based on in the gradual shift scenario, saying 40% of all trips are in scope, right? So not commuting, so most trips are out of scope. And then if you just take the trips are in scope, in the gradual scenario, it says 23% by 2035 will be delivered by delivery AVs. Right? So that's most of your shopping and errand trips still aren't being done by delivery and AVs. And even so, the impacts are quite significant. And I think that that shows that really there's quite a bit of externalities from our driving, which I guess we all everyone on one webinar understands quite significantly. But it shows that if we can, especially, and this is really the second thing, if we, to the degree that we can reduce VMT, the degree to which batching is possible, the degree to which we can replace a trip by a SUV or a pickup truck or a personal car, that can be particularly significant. And so I think that even the batching assumptions, I think, were pretty conservative. The disruptive ship 2035 scenario, so the most aggressive assumption was, I think, two trips batched at once, and that's obviously not a huge assumption as an average. If you think about different kinds of vehicles that could be used for delivery. Even so, you see quite a significant impact from reducing vehicles miles traveled. So I think that those are probably the two things that were most surprising to me, and interested to hear what was particularly surprising for you, Alia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that. I would say also that, so I think one of the perks to have these three scenarios to see, how certain indicator are definitely changing the type of result we're getting. So you'll see the numbers in the disruptive scenario are very high. Conservative scenario, obviously, you would see not that to the same level. I'd say that what seems to be interesting is to see that with certain indicator, especially AV technology and AV regulation being pushed or not, we're seeing very different results. So I think that was one of the first interesting thing. The other thing is that that really surprised me is how as you said, Matt, I think it was more in the economic impact analysis, is to see, for 1 million investment in the AV delivery sector, you get around 3.2 billion dollars into the US economy. It's highly predictive, and I think this is also something that because I guess this is also part of this is a technology sector, so we were expecting these to be high, but not necessarily to that level. So that was another point. And maybe the third one is there have been some obviously analysis and economic impact analysis on AV in the past. Some include sometimes wider benefits, but not to the extent, or I've not seen to the extent that the one we've been trying to do here. So, adding obviously the road accident, this is certainly one of the most important, the environmental and the time saving, I think is also something that I was quite interested in when I started, because I was not able to see a lot of data on that topic before starting working on this.
Great. Yeah, I mean, if one of the things that kind of struck me is that it seemed like from the analysis that all of the net benefits seem to be very positive, right? So there's a lot to like. But a question for you, Matthew. So Nuro's working on these delivery vehicles. Can you give us a sense for the realistic timeline for the deployment of your technology, and what does that initial product actually look like?
Yeah, great. So let me just very briefly introduce what Nuro's vehicle and product is, and I think it'll help answer this question. So Nuro is a 4-year-old company and we have built a custom vehicle and a fully self-driving software and a service where we partner with retailers to do local deliveries. So we started actually 2 years ago with our first commercial delivery service, which was just 1 zip code in Scottsdale, Arizona with Kroger. So a realistic timeline for deployment is sort of -2 years in a sense, but that's not really what you mean, right? So the question is, how are we going to scale this technology? And I think that that's going to happen in stages. So right now, we have moved to Houston, Texas, and we're operating a delivery service there with Kroger as well as with CVS Pharmacy. And that service area is about 150,000 people. So it's a pretty good size, but still, not yet at city scale. And that's what we're working to build towards over the next year or two, is getting to city scale in what is the 4th, probably soon to be the 3rd largest metropolitan area in the country. And then I think what you'll see after that is more expansion, right? So it's not the case like with TNCs or scooters where you're just going to wake up one morning and there's 1,000 delivery robots on your streets overnight. It's going to be a case that's more deliberative than that because it takes more to develop. It's a complex technical process to deploy vehicles in a new city, and you're building a new vehicle that has to be at automotive grade reliability. So that I think is going to be a more deliberative time scale. But with the delivery use case, I think one of the things that's different about delivery than other kinds of autonomy is that you can actually start deploying it in an area right away and actually start getting those learnings from that initial service. So if you think about when you get in a taxi, you want to go where you want to go, right? And so the service area for that has to be, a decent size in order for that taxi ride to be worthwhile in a commercial service. It has to probably include things like airports, which is probably the most common taxi destination, but is a particularly challenging thing for an autonomous vehicle to be able to drive in. With the delivery use case, we can define a particular zone of operations, and we can launch there in a deployment that even 2 years ago, and actually provide a real commercial service, right? People really depend on these grocery deliveries every week. And even though it's and so if you're in Houston and you live in this area, the service is actually here for you today. Well, the other reason that I think delivery, can be a little bit earlier in this deployment cycle is because of a technological thing, which is that if you've got a passenger in the vehicle, you've got to think about occupant comfort, occupant safety, and protecting other road users. With a vehicle like Nuro's, which is a custom-built vehicle called R2 that has no space for anyone inside of it, we just focus on protecting other road users. So that can translate into the vehicle design, right? It's designed to protect people outside the vehicle, and it can also translate into driver behavior. So think about if you've got a brick that's in the road or something, you can suddenly slam on the brakes when you see that. If there's someone in the vehicle, that is first obviously uncomfortable, but you also have to worry about whiplash, right? And there's a lot of examples like that we can think of. And so I think that you'll see delivery be a little bit earlier in the deployment cycle, particularly now as there's an increased interest and demand for contactless deliveries.
Got it. So we at Eno have been following the development of AVs for a while now, with our first paper released in 2013. And I think if we were having this same conversation in 2015, most panelists would have said, well, by 2020, of course, we're going to see widespread automated vehicles all over the roads. And it was, I think people were very kind of bullish on the deployment of the technology. We've seen some of those timelines slip, sometimes for good reason, and I think kind of a reset on the expectations. Your report, Alia, is kind of looking at 2025 as kind of a start year. You're looking at the benefits from 2025 to 2035, kind of indicating that in some maybe 5 years from now, there's going to be enough of these delivery robots on the road that it can actually have a demonstrable impact on the broader transportation system. What kind of assurances can we have that that's an accurate timeline, and that from 5 years from now, when you guys are on the next webinar on this subject, we're talking about real impacts on the broader transportation system?
That's a really good question, and I thank you again, Jaap, for mentioning the fact that the studies start these analyses in 2025 to 2035 under the different scenarios I've mentioned. And this is an assumption, obviously, we took when we started this project. Think that the uptake prior to 2025 is expected to be modest. Therefore, the impact analysis starts at this 2025, when the commercial delivery AV fleet would begin operating at scale. That is the assumption we took for this report. Obviously, the certainty would depend on the different indicator I mentioned during the presentation, and I think a bit during the Q&A, which are we see that the three scenarios are changing differently depending on government decision to push or be more proactive on this ecosystem, consumer acceptance, and tech innovation. There's different potential where if things go faster, we can see bigger numbers by 2025. But if one of these indicators is lagging a bit, we could be more on a conservative scenario where the uptake would be very modest. So there's no final way to answer to your question, Paul, but I think following closely the indicators over the next 5 years will help us understanding if in the next 5 years at the same webinar we'll have the same conversation.
Any thoughts from you, Matthew?
Yeah, so I'll put the reminder on my calendar 5 years from now for another webinar. So I think it's a great point, right? Like, and it's not unfamiliar to those in transportation. I did some work on the Second Avenue subway at one point, right? So there's been a number of delays in that too. So I think that the thing that I really like about this report is the scenarios analysis, that we could be in a conservative scenario, which is only 18% of the benefits in 2035 versus the gradual shift scenario, right? That's a pretty significant, obviously, range, but I think it recognizes that uncertainty. And so if we don't actually update our government policies, if we don't make the technology work, and in particular, if we don't build public trust, then we're not going to actually get these results at all. And so I do think that deliveries are particularly interesting case here, because I talked a little bit about why the technology might come a little bit sooner, but if you think from a regulator perspective, when there's no one in the vehicle, you've cut the risk exposure associated with the technology significantly. You can actually redesign this vehicle to be better for pedestrians, for cyclists, right? Our vehicle is half the size of a standard car, and there's things you can do to redesign that vehicle to actually make it safer for other road users. Makes it more of a natural first starting point for regulators to do those government policies. And we've seen that with, I think, the first approval for an autonomous vehicle exemption petition for a Nuro vehicle from the federal government, California's driverless testing permit being only the second for Nuro. I think that those are examples of how regulators can, I think, understand that there's a lower risk and a higher benefit in some cases from this application. And then I did mention public trust. I think that's really, really critical. This is obviously difficult to do in the COVID times. But we need to get out there and talk to people and introduce them to the technology. And one of the ways that I'm hopeful is if you get a pizza showing up outside at your curb from a vehicle that looks like it's smiling, it's an approachable vehicle, that's your first experience with an autonomous vehicle. I'm hopeful that will build more public trust, which will increase the consumer acceptance of this technology and enable all kinds of applications, not just, pizza delivery, but everything to come. And so I think that the delivery technology is a way of building that public trust a little bit more quickly, and so we can actually get some of these benefits in 2025 instead of the later years.
Got it. Yeah. So we got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have some time for some of the other questions that are coming in regarding public policy and community outreach and jobs. So let's talk policy first. Right now, I don't think anyone has any kind of illusion that we're going to have a federal automated vehicles bill before the election in November. What are the big priorities from a policy standpoint, not only here in DC, but also around the country at the state and local level? One of the recommendations that you had in the paper, Alia, was to harmonize the regulatory environment. Who does that and how? And what are some of the initiatives that we need to undertake? So let's start with you, Matthew, and then go to Alia.
Great. So I think that makes sense. And what you said in terms of the outlook for the rest of this year, I think the priority right now is surface transportation continuing resolution here in DC. But I think a lot of the priorities are the same ones that we've been talking about for the past few years. But there's actually a lot of action happening. It's more at the Department of Transportation here in the federal level. Right? So we've had this year the first exemption approval. We've had the first notice of proposed rulemaking to update the occupant protection standards, which would make clear that for a vehicle that will never have a person in it, you don't need to have airbags and a seatbelt on a driver's seat. We're hopeful that regulation can continue moving over the course of the rest of this year, and that the department can start rulemaking on the other side of things, the manual control side, right? And start the process of saying, okay, how do we adjust the need for a brake pedal in a vehicle that doesn't have any person that'll ever be in it to use that brake pedal, and the same for steering wheels and mirrors and so forth. And that's really important, because one of the big things of this report is that one of the key first things is investment, and then investment drives the economic activity. And so if you think about from the perspective of a manufacturer like Nuro, we want the regulatory certainty to know that if we build this vehicle, it will be legal, that we can actually operate it. That's why those regulations are so important to actually getting that investment. So I think that continues to be a big priority. Another thing that I think we'll probably see, which is related, is potentially the first advanced notice of proposed rulemaking specifically about occupantless vehicles. So this is on the regulatory agenda for later this year, to actually start saying, hey, do we need a new class of vehicles? How are these vehicles different? And in the 1990s, the DOT actually created a new class of vehicles called low-speed vehicles, and they did it in only 2 years, which is much faster than many other regulations. And so this could be the start of something like that, where we say this is a new kind of vehicle, it's different than others, we should set the standards appropriately. The last thing I'll mention is I think we're going to see particular attention to delivery. Yesterday, Energy and Commerce passed successfully out of the markup a bill that included provisions to study these vehicles, called the Advancing Unmanned Delivery Services Act. And so it would actually build on studies like what Steer did. And I think it's actually interesting, because this is a bipartisan bill and it's passed out of the Democratic House committee. And I think it reflects that this delivery use case is a place where we can actually see bipartisan cooperation 2 months before an election that I think is significant, that if we're going to see progress, it may well be in the area of delivery AVs.
Mhm. That's a really good summary. I don't know if I can add
Okay.
anything to that.
Well, that's okay. Actually, I have a question, I guess, more for you. One of the things that Matthew brought up was the community outreach engagement, gaining public trust. And one of the recommendations you presented on your last slide was that we need to develop community outreach and that engagement. Can you give us a sense for who should be leading that effort, and what does community outreach even look like?
Yeah, there's definitely, thank you for the question. I think it's one of the tremendous one on the EV sector in general. Over the past few years, I've done quite a bit of focus group interviews and analysis on barriers and levers to the perception of AV in general and now AV delivery among potential end users. And I think these kind of studies, especially when they can try the services, is something that we should see a bit more, because there's a lot of bias around what we think people are perceiving with these services, including I think more recently there've been some study on because of COVID, the impact of COVID, how would that impact such ecosystem. So I think my point and the recommendation was, first of all, to say, let's do more of that. Let's involve communities at the local level, so city level, county level, to better understand what are the specific constraints of areas and how we can involve more people in trying these services, but also expressing what are the concerns, or on the reverse, what they are excited about when they hear about AV delivery services, and adapt these services to their specific need. So I think it was really in that sense that we were talking about that. And outreach means many things, but here it's about listening, and depending on the output of what you've been listening, acting either for a public sector or decision maker with set of rules or regulation or specific trainings, but also generally from a public sector point of view, to better understand who are or who will be the potential end users of your services.
Got it. Another question that's come up from a couple folks on the line is about jobs. One of the big things the report concluded is net benefit over the 10 years would be a net job creation rather than job loss. But I think it's not lost on folks that might mean some people do lose their jobs even if more jobs are created, right? And in particular, a couple of people called out delivery drivers that are already out there delivering, whether it be pizzas or the FedEx, Amazon, UPS drivers that are making the deliveries now. Can you talk a little bit about your recommendation, Alia, for ensuring equitable job creation? How do we do that? What is the kind of methodology for making sure that if there is a big shift in jobs, that it is something that is done in a responsible way?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something I wanted to re-mention, and this is part of like what an input and output analysis is. It is not a cost-benefit analysis. So what you're seeing and the number you're seeing are based on the investment that would be made into that sector, and take into account the direct impact, but also the induced and indirect impact. So in terms of job and job creation, that what it means. And I also recognize that the concept of job years that economists use is not always easy to understand. So we really want, if there's any specific question on that specific section, feel very free to send me emails after this webinar. To answer your question, Paul, ensuring equitable job creation, I think, as I was saying, the first thing we need to do is to better understand with studies where the focus should be done, and especially on what different groups or potential for job creation communities should be done, so that we can work on more policies. That could be, for example, job training program. I think that could be an interesting one that could be implemented to ensure that the widest societal benefit is achieved for this one. But there's many ways. Maybe, Matthew, you have another element to add to that.
Yeah, Matthew, anything on the job side of things?
Yeah, so I'll try and stick within our minute here. So,
Okay, that's true.
so first qualitatively, what have we seen? We've seen actually when we've launched these services, hiring. Right? So we've seen our depots. We're hiring folks to maintain our vehicles, dispatch them. We've seen our retail partners hiring new people to pick and pack the groceries. I think that's a pretty interesting and maybe surprising thing when you think about it, is that but the reason for that is that today when I go to the grocery store, I am driving there myself, I'm picking my own groceries, I'm checking out and coming home. If an autonomous vehicle is doing that driving, then someone needs to be hired at the grocery store to replace that kind of unpaid personal labor, and that needs to be a job to do that picking and packing. And so I think that this is a case where there will be a lot of new jobs created, and many of them are not going to be, sometimes you hear about, oh, job training, how are you going to become a computer engineer? Not all these jobs that'll be created that are technicians or maintaining the vehicles, or those that are picking and packing, will require a PhD in order to transition into. So I think that that's a potential bright spot here. And I also do think that there will always be a demand for in-person delivery to the door, right? Not everyone wants delivery to the curb. Not everyone is going to want delivery overall. Some people want to pick out their own produce. And so I do think that these things will coexist in the future.
And that's actually, so we're a little over time, but I have one more question, then hopefully you guys can answer this kind of briefly. But can I talk just quickly about how this fits into the larger multimodal transportation piece? How does it play in with other modes? It was one of the recommendations that you had, Alia, in your report, was working closely with others for a kind of a multimodal future. But also, how does this play into the competition with drone deliveries or the sidewalk AVs, the other types of automated vehicles that the report talked about? Let's go, we'll have Alia take that one, and then we'll finish up with Matthew.
Okay, I can start with that. So yeah, absolutely, multimodality. I think one of the key buzzword that we've been hearing this past years here in the US has been mobility hubs or mass integration. And we do believe that AV delivery services, if they were used as a concierge service, could help facilitate mobility ecosystem. For example, they could complement transit or other mobility services within a mobility hubs. So you are you're at work, you order your groceries on your way back, you pick them up at the mobility hub station, and you go home. Or that's just an example, but it could be very diverse. And I think this is something that could be very complementary to that. I'm trying to be super fast. Sorry.
Go ahead.
That's great. And yeah, I think this year we have seen also a huge increase in discussion around delivery, because contactless delivery has become so much more important to many people, and many people are trying things like grocery delivery for the first time. I think that we welcome that, right? We think that the more people that try automated delivery in different ways, they're going to like it. I think it's a great experience. Obviously, that's why we're building a product in this space, and that that will increase consumer acceptance, which is one of the key factors. I think you'll see there's a place for each of these, right? If you think about drones, there's a company that is delivering snake anti-venom with drones, right? That's a great use case, right? Because that's something that needs to be there very, very fast, and it's very, very light. Is not drone is not a great case for your weekly groceries with 2 gallons of milk. So it's too heavy, right? So I think that there's, depending on what the use case is, you're going to have each technology is going to have a different space. Our vehicle is built specifically for on-demand delivery. It's got 2 compartments, so it can batch, but it's not going to batch 30 trips. It's not going to replace a FedEx truck and a UPS truck that's delivering every house on the street 50 e-commerce boxes like during the pandemic. So I think that each of these different kind of vehicle modes has a place, and the more we have competition in the space, the better.
Got it. Well, we're over time. Thanks everyone on the line for sticking with us. It's been a really robust discussion. Sorry that we didn't get to everybody's questions. So we'll reach out to you individually to help answer some of those. And if you don't hear from us, of course, you can always reach out to me directly via email or via Twitter. and I think my co-panelists here feel the same way. The report that the steer group published is available on their website, and we'll make sure that's available to folks. And then the slides and recording of this webinar will be available within a few hours of this. So stay tuned for an email from Eno with all that. So I want to thank Alia and Matthew for joining us today, and hope everyone was able to learn something. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.